Good evening and welcome to the World News. Tonight, our reporters will be putting the questions to Raina and Ada, who are climate change experts. Experts on global warming and the significance of global warming on the world today. We hope you'll enjoy our program as our reporters take turns asking the important questions we all want to know. My name is Chrissy York from Canada. Welcome to the World News. And with some questions for our experts on climate change, our first reporter is Barkin.
Is it climate change, global warming, or global climate crisis?
Each of these terms refers to the same thing, the fact that the average temperature of the Earth's atmosphere is rising. As the temperature rises, various impacts are changing aspects of our climate, like hotter summers, rising ocean temperatures, melting polar ice, increased storm activity. These go beyond mere changes in the weather. As these impacts grow in frequency and severity, they will create crises for people and nature around the world. If unchecked, these impacts will spread and worsen with more animal extinction, water shortages, and displaced communities. Whatever you choose to call it, the most important thing is that we act to stop it.
And our reporter, Hallie has some questions as well for our climate change experts.
Is climate change caused by humans?
Yes, over 97% of scientists agree that humans cause climate change. Humanity's accelerated burning of fossil fuels and deforestation have led to rapid increases of greenhouse gases in the atmosphere and global warming. Scientists have known for centuries that gases in Earth's atmosphere like carbon dioxide and methane act like a greenhouse, preventing a certain amount of radiation from escaping back to space. The more carbon dioxide in the atmosphere, the warmer it gets. Over Earth's history, carbon dioxide levels fluctuate due to volcanic activity or the carbon cycle. However, the rise in temperature and the carbon dioxide levels we have seen in the past century are extreme and are accelerating. The rate of carbon emissions are the highest they have been in 66 million years, and the amount of warming in the coming decades is expected to be 250 times greater than the average warming during the past century.
And over to our reporter, Esma. Esma, you have questions.
What are the main threats of climate change?
The main threats of climate change stemming from the rising temperature of Earth's atmosphere include rising sea levels, ecosystem collapse, and more frequent and severe weather. Rising temperatures from human-caused greenhouse gas emissions affects planet-wide system in various ways. For example, it warms the polar regions and oceans, which melts ice cover at the poles and causes sea level rise. Climate change affects ocean habitats by lowering oxygen, decreasing phytoplankton, and killing coral reefs. The warming of the atmosphere affects weather patterns, causing more frequent and severe storms and droughts across many global regions. Higher temperatures are affecting the length of the season and in some places already causing sea levels for ecosystem and humans. All of these impacts and many others will become more severe if we don't act to stop greenhouse gas emissions.
And now our reporter, Nazli, has some questions about global warming and climate change.
How is climate change affecting people?
From straining agriculture systems to making regions less habitable, climate change is affecting people everywhere. You may have noticed how weather patterns near you are shifting, or how more frequent and severe storms are developing in the spring. Maybe your community is experiencing more severe flooding or wildfires. Many areas are even experiencing sunny day flooding as rising sea levels cause streets to flood during high tides. In Alaska, some entire coastal communities are being moved because the sea level has risen to the point where their original location is no longer habitable. Climate change also exacerbates the threat of human-caused conflict resulting from a scarcity of resources like food and water that are less reliable as growing seasons change and seasons become less predictable. Many of these impacts are happening disproportionately in low-income, indigenous or marginalized communities. Around the globe, many of the poorest nations are being impacted first and most severely by climate change, even though they have contributed far less to the increase in carbon emissions that has caused the warming in the first place.
Hallie, I see that you'd like to interrupt here. You've got another question for us. Go ahead.
How is climate change affecting animals?
Changing climates directly and indirectly cause stress to animals across the world. Many species are approaching or have already reached the limit of where they can go to find hospitable climates. In the polar regions, animals like polar bears that live on polar ice are now struggling to survive as that ice melts. It's not just how climate change affects an animal directly, it's about how the warming climate affects the ecosystems and food chain that animal has adapted to. In the USA and Canada, moose are struggling due to an increase in ticks and parasites that are surviving the shorter, milder winters. In another case, salmon rely on steady flowing cold rivers to spawn. As climate change alters the temperature and flow of these waterways, some salmon populations are dwindling. This affects many species that rely on salmon like orcas or grizzly bears. In both oceans and on land, the changes in temperature and moisture are causing some species to migrate in search of new places to live. For instance, in North America, species are shifting their ranges an average of 11 miles north and 36 feet higher in elevation each decade to find more favorable conditions. The Central Appalachians, one resilient climate escape route that may help species adapt to changing conditions. That are some natural places with enough diversity in altitude and geology such that as the planet warms, they can be resilient strongholds for plant and animal species. The strongholds serve as breeding grounds and seed banks for many plants and animals that otherwise may be unable to find habitat due to climate change. However, strongholds are not an option for all species, and some plants and animals are blocked from reaching strongholds by human development like cities, highways, and farmland.
Yes, Esma, go ahead with your question.
How is climate change affecting the ocean?
Warming ocean temperatures are melting polar ice, shifting ocean currents and fish migrations and leading to coral bleaching and die-off. Because of oceans' important role in regulating Earth's climate by absorbing greenhouse gas emissions, they are taking a direct hit from climate change. All of this extra absorbed carbon dioxide is altering the chemistry of our oceans, making them more acidic. In fact, the rate of the ocean acidification is the highest it has been in 300 million years. This negatively impacts the loss of marine habitats and animals, but is a particular threat to shellfish who struggle to grow shells as water becomes more acidic. There are deeper issues at play. As the ocean surface warms, it's less able to mix with deep, nutrient-rich water, which limits the growth of phytoplankton, little plants that serve as the base of the marine food web. This in turn affects the whole food chain. There is also some evidence that warming surface waters may be contributing to slowing ocean currents. Together, these currents act like a giant global conveyor belt that transports heat from the tropics toward the poles. This conveyor belt is critical for bringing nutrient-rich waters towards the surface near the poles where giant blooms of food web supporting blooms of phytoplankton occur. This is why the Arctic and Antarctic are known for having such high abundance of fish and marine mammals.
Okay, now back to you, Nasli. You have another question for our experts.
How is climate change affecting farms and our food?
Climate change is disrupting weather patterns, leading to more extreme and frequent droughts and flooding events that directly threaten harvests. The warming climate is contributing to rising population of insect pests that eat a higher share of crop yields. In the Midwestern United States, more frequent and intense rains have caused devastating spring flooding, which delays and sometimes prevents planting activities. These impacts make it more difficult for farmers to grow crops and sustain their livelihoods. However, farmers are poised to play a significant role in addressing climate change. Agricultural lands are among the Earth's largest natural reservoirs of carbon, and when farmers use soil health practices like cover crops, reduced tillage, and crop rotations, they can draw even more carbon out of the atmosphere. These practices also help to improve the soil's water holding capacity, which is beneficial as water can be absorbed from the soil by crops during times of drought, and during heavy rainfalls, soil can help reduce flooding and runoff by slowing the release of water into streams. Healthier soils can also improve crop yields, boost farmers' profitability, and reduce erosion and fertilizer runoff from farm fields, which in turn means cleaner waterways for people and nature.
Barkin, I see that you have another question.
Does deforestation contribute to climate change?
Yes, absolutely. Deforestation contributes to climate change in a couple ways. Forests are one of our most important types of natural carbon storage, so when forests get cut down, they lose their ability to store the greenhouse gas. Burning trees release even more carbon into the atmosphere. Forests are some of the best natural climate solutions we have on this planet. If we can slow or stop deforestation and manage natural land so that it is healthy, we could achieve up to 1/3 of the emissions reductions needed by 2030 to keep global temperatures from rising more than 2 degrees, about 3.6 degrees. That's the equivalent of the world putting a complete stop to burning oil.
Okay, so we have just enough time now that each of our reporters can ask their final questions. Esma, how about you go first? Your final question, please.
What can we do to stop climate change?
You can be part of the climate change solution. First, calculate your carbon footprint and take actions you can to lower it. You might be surprised which of your activities are emitting the most greenhouse gases. It's really important that we use our voices for climate action. Tell your policymakers that you care about climate change and want to see them enact laws and policies that address greenhouse gas emissions and climate impacts. One of the simplest and most important things that everyone can do is to talk about climate change with family and friends. We know these conversations can seem like a recipe for discord and hard feelings. It starts with meeting people where they are at. TNC has resources to help you break the climate silence and pave the way for action on global warming.
And Holly, your final question for our experts.
What are solutions to climate change?
In our order to avoid the worst impacts of climate change, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change says we must reduce carbon emissions to the point where we hold global warming to no more than an additional 1.5 Celsius. To do that, we must, as a planet, commit ourselves to reach net zero carbon emissions by 2050. This is no small feat and will require a range of solutions applied together to reach the goal. We will need to transition all the sectors of our economy away from fossil fuels that emit carbon, increase our use of clean energy sources like wind and solar, harness the power of nature to capture carbon, and deploy technologies that capture and store carbon. This transition will happen much faster and more cost-effectively if governments enact an economy-wide price on carbon. Our research also shows that proper land management of forests and farmlands, also called natural climate solutions, can provide up to 1/3 of the emissions reductions necessary to reach the Paris Climate Agreement's goal of aiming to keep temperature rise below 1.5 degrees above pre-industrial levels. The truth, however, is that even if we do successfully reach net zero carbon emissions by 2050, we will still have to address harmful climate impacts. And so the solution to climate change must also include measures to adapt to impacts of global warming. It's particularly important that we help the most vulnerable communities adapt to climate change impacts. For example, Pacific Islanders and disadvantaged communities living in low-lying areas of Houston, Miami, or Jakarta are the least responsible for the emissions causing climate change, but the most likely to suffer the consequences.
And Nasli, over to you with your final question.
How much time do we have to stop climate change?
The truth is there is not a hard and fast deadline on climate action, etc. inaction. Some studies and articles suggest that unless we make significant progress towards decarbonization, reducing carbon from the atmosphere and replacing fossil fuels in our economies by 2030, we may be facing catastrophic climate impacts that would overwhelm our communities and pose an existential threat to certain ecosystems. There is no definitive line of demarcation that we can protect against. Instead, it is a matter of minimizing the effects of climate change. Every day that goes by, we are releasing carbon into the atmosphere and increasing our planetary risk. Most scientists agree that we need to begin reducing carbon emissions right now to give our planet and our population the future that is least impacted.
Barkin, your final question for our experts, please.
What happens if we do nothing to stop climate change?
If we do not take further action to stop climate impacts we are already experiencing, the planet is likely to see global temperatures rise by about 4 degrees by the end of the century. This type of warming could lead to catastrophic melting of the ice sheets in Greenland and Antarctica, causing sea level rise that would flood most major global coastal cities. The wildlife will low and their habitat will be destroyed, leading to mass species extinction. Superstorms, drought, and heat waves would become increasingly common and more extreme, leading to major health crises and illness. Agricultural production would plummet, likely leading to global food shortages and famine. Water supplies would disappear around the world, making some regions nearly inhabitable.
Ladies and gentlemen, that's our show for this evening. I hope you enjoyed hearing the questions from our reporters around the world and their important answers to those questions from our experts. Thank you and have a good night.